best classes ever. The last 3 weeks.
Works very well.
That's why I can, because now today it's going to be
Sorry?
the better one.
That
No,
works
no,
very
no.
well.
Oh, good. I'm glad.
Last week,
My father told me that you, yeah, that you.
watch it in fly, the listening fly.
Baruch Hashem.
יש לי זוג חברים שבדיוק שם עכשיו.
All right. Gentlemen, we are in the middle of chapter 7. We've just started, actually. It's a long chapter. We're going to have a lot to say, many classes, but we are making progress. We're slowly but surely going through chapter 7. Now, last week...
announcement, we are very excited.
Last week, yeah, Baruch Hashem. Last week we spoke about... we were summarizing and we were explaining last week, a lot of last week's class was about why there even has to be a chapter 7, right? Why does there have to be a chapter 7? In the first 6 chapters, right, we conclusively demonstrate, in short, that the world is nothing but godliness. It's a ray, it's like the ray of the sun within the sun. And this is true not just mitzad Shem Havaya, not just because of God's self-revelatory act, not just because he is revealing himself in the act of creation, but even because he is concealing himself in the act of creation. Even Shem Elokim is no contradiction to this truth. From God's perspective, Shem Elokim and Shem Havaya are really the same. Havaya v'Elokim kul echad. To him, there's no difference. All there is the expression of him here. Elokim does not make the world more a world or more of a reality outside of him in any way. Right? From his perspective, the world and the world source, there's no difference between the two. Right? Between the divine breath which he uses to speak the world into existence and the world itself. There's no difference. It's like the ray of the sun and the sun. So what else is there left to say, right? In other words, we set out basically to explain an idea in Achdus Hashem, how to come to love of Hashem. And we understand that Hashem, everything that we love is really from Hashem. Everything that we know is from Hashem. Every aspect of everything that exists is really just an expression of godliness. Right, our whole lives is basically within one expression of godliness. There's no concealment, not truly. The only concealment is from our perspective. From his perspective, he is as present here as he is present everywhere. Right, the closeness of God, love of God. So what is there left to discuss? And we explained that really there's 2 aspects to Achdus Hashem. There's 2 aspects, generally speaking, to the unity of God, to appreciating God's unity, the fact that the world is nothing, that there is nothing else other than God truly, right? There's 2 aspects. One aspect is that nothing truly exists apart from him, independent of God, which is what we've been discussing for 6 chapters. But there is another aspect, and this other aspect we really haven't explored as much. This other aspect says that not only does nothing exist independently of Hashem, not only is there nothing other than him, but in truth, there is nothing that has an importance that is commensurate to his. He does not see anything as truly important. And we explained what that means, right? We explained what that meant. What does it mean that you find something important, right? So we went into it. We explained that if you are defined as the source of something, right? In other words, we used an example. We spoke about how Hashem says, Yehi or, let there be light, and that creates light, right? And with that it is his constantly speaking, let there be light, that is actually light. That's what light actually really truly is. If we could see beyond the illusion that is created by Shem Elokim, if we could see things from his perspective, we would see that all light is his words, Yehi or, let there be light. However, we said that since let there be light, since those words, Yehi or, are for creating light specifically, since they are directed towards light, right? In other words, Yehi or will create light rather than chickens or frogs or stones, right? Let there be light is the specific phrase meant to create light. In other words, it is an aspect of godliness which is directed towards, which is for, in a sense, creating light. If the words are for creating light, that means that light is of great importance to these words. right? It means light matters. A different way of saying it is that this godly expression is a specific godly expression meant to yield a certain result, right? It's meant to produce something specifically. Yehi, God says it in order to create light specifically. What that means is that the result, which is light as we know it, physical light, precedes, assuming that's what God created on the first day when he said, let there be light, which is actual physical light. Let's put that aside. That's a separate issue. But the very fact that this is meant to produce this result means that the light exists even before it exists, right? The physical light precedes its physical existence, right? In other words, if you have a process that, right, so for example, if you have a builder that's building a house, right, a process that is meant to produce a specific result, so the house exists before the physical house is built. Because the plans that the builder has drawn up, the ideas in their mind, etc., right, all of these things exist already. The house is already exerting influence conceptually. The house is already exerting influence conceptually in terms of the purpose of what we're doing, the goals of what we're doing. If I were planning on building a skyscraper instead of a house, my current plans would be very different. What does that show? That shows that the house, the intended goal, is determining what I am doing now. It's determining the nature of my plans. So in other words, it is a results-oriented process. And a results-oriented process, by necessity, demands that the results have importance. Right? So in other words, even if the world has no independent reality of God, even if the light is nothing other than the words Yehi, the light still has some sort of importance. It exists in the realm of godliness. The light holds sway, right? Godliness is directed. What God is doing when he is speaking is an act which is directed towards producing this result. And in this sense, the world has importance. In a subtle way, this is a contradiction to the unity of Hashem. A contradiction to God's unity, that there is nothing other than him. Because even though the light has no independent existence, this thing which has no independent existence is still important. It's still important. It's important that there be this thing called light, right? At least to the Maimer Yehi. But at the end of chapter 6, the Alter Rebbe slips in, and you could miss it if you're not paying attention, it's like in 2 or 3 words. The Alter Rebbe slips in the idea that the source of the world is also one with Hashem. In other words, the source of the worlds is as purposeless in the positive sense, in the godly sense, as God is. Right? The source of the worlds, the place where the world comes from, the divine act which is creating them, that we've been discussing, right? The act which has a Havaya aspect and an Elokim aspect, right? The divine act which creates the world, all this very act is as the world is as unimportant to this act as it is to God himself, which of course God himself is defined as not needing anything other than himself, right? He creates everything and is created by nothing. Everything needs him and he needs nothing, right? As the Rambam defines God at the beginning of Mishnah Torah, the first few laws in his famous work of Jewish law. So the source of the world is as independent. It sees the world as unimportant as God himself does. In order to understand this, we need at least a chapter 7. We need more, right? We need more Shaar HaYichud v'Emunah. This second point, that the worlds are of no importance, is the point that is driving us further. Because without this point, we could say that, okay, metaphysics ahin, metaphysics aher, as we would say in Yiddish English, right? In our Yinglish, we would say metaphysics ahin, metaphysics aher, but sof kol sof, the world is important, right? God needs to create this world. When God is speaking, Yehi, he's doing it only to create the world, so the world is important to God. You say it doesn't have an independent existence, you explain what that existence truly is. It doesn't matter what that existence truly is, because the truth of that existence is that it's important, right? There is something which matters to God. There is something which compels God to act, and to act in a certain way. Yes? This is, God forbid to say such a thing. Therefore, we have a chapter 7. We began to explain. May I borrow a watch from someone, if you don't mind? Thank you. Thank you. We began to explain. It's good. I got it. It's fine. We began to explain the trait of malchus, the trait of rulership, right? Because really, in order to answer this question, we of course have to answer another question, right? This question that I just asked, right? The Alter Rebbe starts the chapter and he says, now we can finally understand the two types of yichud, that Shema Yisrael is yichud Eilah, and Baruch Shem is yichud Tata. Shema Yisrael is the higher unity of God, and Baruch Shem is the lower level unity of God. And then he immediately changes to a different subject, right, as is customary. We are now, so he said that in order to understand this, we have to understand God's trait of malchus, his trait of kingship. And the trait of kingship explains something very important that is also unexplained until this point in Shaar HaYichud ve'emunah, which is essentially if Havaya sees the world as nothing other than God, nothing other than godliness, and Elokim sees the world as nothing other than godliness, then why don't we see the world as nothing other than godliness, right? In other words, the answer to why we don't see godliness on the table is Shem Elokim, right? But the question is, why did God do that, right? Why do I need a Shem Elokim? What's Shem Elokim for? Right? Why is there a Shem Elokim? If all Shem Elokim is creating a certain perspective of separation for us, from our perspective, not even from his perspective, right? Then what is the purpose of Shem Elokim? Does God just want to punish us? In other words, why can't we partake in what everyone else seems to know, which is that everything is godliness and godliness is everything? Why are we left out, right? And the answer is, of course, expecting simple answers to this question would be a mistake. But the answer the Alter Rebbe says here is because of his malchus, because of his kingship. He wants his kingship to be revealed, right? He naturally is, of course, perfect. So he doesn't need to revealing his kingship. Don't think that adds anything to his perfection, in other words. That's what I mean by it's not a simple answer. In other words, this is every answer to this question of why create anything, or why have a universe, or why have a Shem Elokim, which is all really the same question, as we're going to discuss more tonight. The answers to these questions is always, but why does he need to do that? And the answer will always eventually be, you can't ask questions. This question terminates in, you can't ask questions on an irrational desire. Chassidus holds, the Alter Rebbe holds, that God creates the universe out of an irrational desire. In other words, there is no reason. We can discuss that more another night, maybe. But within there not being a reason, one of the reasons why he creates the world is to express his kingship. In other words, I don't want to confuse you too much. We're going to explain why the world is created, why there's a Shem Elokim, because he wants to express his kingship. Just know that you could always ask, why does he want to express his kingship? And there is no rational answer to that question. That's just what the preface that I wanted to make. But he wants to reveal his kingship. What is kingship, right? We explained, very simple, from a human king, we explained that a king is someone to whom others are subservient. But you cannot be a king over your sons, and you cannot even be a king over your ministers. Even if you have many, many sons or many, many ministers, that would not let you that would not allow you to be a king. We explained why. Because, in the simple understanding, right, just as very straightforward, because people who recognize the greatness of the king, people who are close to the king, cannot really see him as a king. That's not what a king is. That's what a father is. That's what a boss is. A king needs a nation. Ein melech b'loi am. The Bechaye, we quoted from the Bechaye. There is no king without a nation. And we said, what's am? Am milashon umamos, right? Distance. Extinguished, right? We said the extinguished coal, the extinguished fire, right? The unenlightened, literally, right? A king is a king only of a nation of people who do not appreciate his light. A king is a king only when he has a connection with people. It has to be people, as we'll discuss tonight, but with people who cannot truly appreciate him, who cannot truly appreciate his worth. They are people that are incommensurate to him, who are lower, so low that they don't even appreciate who he is. Over such a group, you can become a king, which is why Berev am hadras melech. That's why you need a large nation. Berev am, in a multiplicity of people. Hadras melech is the greatness of the king. This is an example. This is a reason given. For example, this is a halachic concept. Berev am hadras melech. For example, when it speaks about the laws of making kiddush on Friday night, there's a discussion, I should say, over whether it's better that we should all listen to one person's kiddush or each person should make their own kiddush on Friday night. And the reason given why we should all listen to one person's kiddush, which is the most common practice by far, the reason why we should all listen to one person's kiddush is because Berev am hadras melech. God's kingship, when you're making a kiddush, and you're best Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech HaOlam, right? You're making the blessings for kiddush and calling God king over the world. Where do you see the greatness of the king? Specifically in many people, right? Because when you reach many, it's like that number. I don't know if any of you know the name, right? There's a certain number that they have, I think in sociology or psychology, where they say there's this maximum number of people you can know well at any one time. There's a certain term for it. You may have heard of this idea, like you can only be friends with a certain number of people, right? Before it's too much. There's just no way to be psychologically or whatever it is to have friends with more people. But anyway,
Mr. Politician.
All right. Well, there's friends and then there's friends, right? Which is the whole point. The whole point is that our politicians are not kings, so they have to pretend to be your friends, unlike a king. That's the whole point, right? The point is that our politicians are not kings in the Chassidic sense of the word king. The king does not pretend to be your friend, which is the whole point. That's what makes him a king. The Rev Am, right? You have millions of people, thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people. They cannot all know you personally. That specifically, the fact that they don't know you, the fact that they don't know what you're about, that you're above them in a distant sense, that distance is what creates kingship, as opposed to other relationships. That's what we explained. Therefore, why, if God wants to reveal his kingship, he wants someone to know that he's a king, it cannot be over a reality that is close to him. It cannot be over a reality that knows it is nothing other than him, that defines itself in terms of him. So where can he be a king? Where can his kingship be felt? That people know he's a king only through a tzimtzum, only through a self-contraction, a self-concealment, what we've been calling Shem Elokim. Yes, only through Shem Elokim can there be a place that is distant enough from him, right? A place that thinks it's separate, that thinks it has its own life, right? That's what a king is. A king is someone in a far-off town who you live in his country, but you live your own life, and it could be you never have anything to do with him at all. That's a king, yeah? That is the idea. So too, our world, only with Shem Elokim. So why is there a Shem Elokim? Why is there a Tzimtzum? Explains the Alter Rebbe, because he wants his kingship to be revealed. That's what we explained in last week's class. Today we are going to go more into this idea of kingship. We'll probably be speaking about kingship for at least the next 2 weeks, possibly the next 3 weeks, all about kingship, this idea that God is king. So without further ado, let's read further. We're going to start from page 910 in the English, the last line. On 910 in the Hebrew, yes. Shem, v'shem ha'meireh. Al midas malchusei. V'shem ha'meireh al midas malchusei, the name which refers to the trait of his majesty, of his kingship, his malchus, may it be blessed, who Shem Adnus, is the name Adnus, of Adnus, or Adnai, right? I'm intentionally mispronouncing, so as not to say the name. Yes? The Shem Adnai, which we say all the time, right? This is the Shem we use instead of pronouncing Shem Havaya, right? Yeah, everybody's familiar with this concept that in earlier times it was known how to pronounce the Shem Havaya. We don't know how to pronounce Shem Havaya anymore. Besides, they wouldn't pronounce it all the time. It would only be pronounced in the Beis Hamikdash in its fullest sense, etc., etc. Long story short, instead, everywhere that we see written the Shem Havaya, we say a different name. Right, we say the Shem Adnai, the Shem associated with Adnai. Now you might know the Shem Adnut. Adnus means mastery. Adonai means my master, right? As you may know, there are 7 names in halacha, there are 7 names in Jewish law of Hashem which are not to be erased. If you go, the Rambam, I believe, has a whole section. There are 7 names which once written are not meant to be erased, 7 names of Hashem. Kabbalistically, these 7 names correspond to spheres. They correspond to different aspects of godliness. The very last one, associated with the lowest sphera, the last sphera, the sphera of Malchus, the godly, the divine trait of kingship, is Adonai. That's the name, the holy name, the unerasable name of God associated with this trait. And as the Tzemach Tzedek points out in one of his Maimarim, these names refer not to the trait, but to God himself, right? In other words, just as, that's how Hebrew works, right? So there's 2 different things. There's Chachma, right? Which is wisdom. And then there's a Chacham, right? Which is the person that is wise, the person who acquires Chachma, right? We actually call him a Chacham. It's his name. That's what you call him. He is a wise person. So too with God, there's 2 different things. There's the name, or the Sphira, which is Malchus, right? Sorry, the name of the trait, or the Sphira, which is Malchus. And then you have the name, which refers to he himself, right? Because he lowers himself down to have this divine trait of Malchus, this divine trait of kingship, we call him Adonai. Right? It's a name referring to him because he has a certain trait, because he expresses himself with this trait of Malchus. Yes, just to a note on the names. So the divine name of all the divine names of Hashem, which refers to his kingship, is the name of Adnus, Kihu Adon Kol Haaretz, because he is the master of all the earth. V'nimtza, top of 9:11. V'nimtza, we find, ki midazu v'shem zed is this trait of kingship and this name of Adnus, of mastery. Hein hamahavin u'mekaymin ha'elam liyos elam kameshu achshav. They are what create and sustain the world and allow it to be a world as it is now. In other words, and here things are getting subtly more complex. I'll do my best to explain clearly, God willing. What is it that makes the world the way it is now is his trait of Malchus. Now, earlier in Tanya, in chapter 4, I believe, of Shaar HaYichud v'Emunah, we said that what name or sphera is it that creates the world? We said it was the name of Havaya, right? We said Havaya is Miloshen Mahave, right? Havaya, the 4-letter name of God, is it comes from the verb of creating, to make something be a different trait in a different name, the trait of Malchus. Now, the trait of kingship. So which one is it? Is it Havaya? Oh, Havaya we said was his kindness, right? I should say in English, right? We said, so is it God's kindness which creates the world? Or is it his kingship which creates the world? And the answer is that if you understand, it's not a contradiction at all, right? Because it's his kindness which creates anything at all, right? That there should be anything other than him is his kindness. But if there was only his kindness, everything would be totally bottled, would be totally nullified to God, like the ray of the sun in the sun, right? That was the whole point in chapter 4, that you needed a tzimtzum, a concealment of God, in order to produce the world the way we see it, right? If it was just Havaya, if it was just his kindness, we would see that the truth of everything is the godliness which is constantly creating it. Everything is like the ray of the sun in the sun. So when we say that it's Malchus which creates, that it's his kingship which creates the world, we mean in a different sense. It's not his kingship which creates the world, period, that there should be anything. It's his kingship, as the Alter Rebbe says, that creates the world as it is now. Why is it that we are in a world in which he is concealed? Because of his Malchus, because of his kingship. So why does it exist at all? Because of Shem Havaya. But why does it exist in the way with which we're familiar? Because of Shem Malchus, because of Malchus, Shem Adnus, right? Because of his kingship, not because of his kindness.
That's a lot of words.
It is a lot of words. I'm trying to translate each one after I say it. If I miss one, please let me know.
So which one is related to Atzmut? I mean, the Yud Kei Vav is.
Oh, it's related to Atmos. Everything is related to Atmos. There's no.
But it's like the highest level.
I don't know. I don't know how to answer that question. Atmos, by definition, is not related to anything, or it's related to everything. Either one. In other words, Atmos is not. We're talking about Spheres. We're not talking about Atmos at all. Atmos is not involved. A fair question. Atmos is not involved. Atmos is involved in everything. God forbid Atmos is not involved. But it's not what we're discussing here.
No, but if I may,
Atmos means God's very self. God's very self beyond all traits or beyond all expressions. Here, we're describing the divine acts. We're talking about things that he does, right? He creates with chesed. He is concealed with malchus, right? These are all things that he does. So he's called by a shem, right? It's a name. The name also has a different term, which is called spheros, which refers to a certain divine reality. The 10 divine emanations with which he creates things. So all of these things, in other words, none of these things are his very self, right? We're describing, we're lefi maisani ekra, right? He's named according to his actions. So here we're talking about the divine actions. We're not talking about the self. Maybe later in Shaar HaYichud ve'emunah, we'll climb up the ladder a bit more and try and see. Generally speaking, you should know, just in general, it's a good introduction to an introductory point in learning Chassidus in general, that whenever you're talking about any levels or definitions or anything, you're not talking about God himself. In other words, God himself is not on the map in general. If you're talking about something that could be in a map or a chart or a structure, right? God himself is not on the map or the chart or the structure. In fact, he's not even on it in a way where you would write at the top that God is not on this chart, right? He is the chart. He is it. He's above the distinction of being it or not being it, right? You go figure that whatever that means. So it is this malchus. So we have his chesed, his kindness, shem havaya, right? That God's kindness, which is the trait which creates infinitely and does infinite kindness at all times. But then what makes that kindness expressed as the world that we see it, as a place which is separate from him, his trait of kingship. Because it's only for his kingship that something separate from him, even in our perception, should exist. So why does he conceal himself? In order that he can be a king. So therefore, what is the act of creation? The act of creating something which conceals him is essentially a trait associated with malchus, is a trait associated with kingship, the divine majesty, because he wants his kingship to be revealed.
Can you start slightly differently? Because, suppose you rearrange the sentence to say, because God wants to reveal his kingship.
Yes. Therefore, he creates a world. He creates a reality in which he is not known directly, because that is the only way for a king to be a king, rather than some other relationship. And therefore, he conceals himself from us and creates the reality we live within, in which the godly truth of everything is not directly experienced, but rather concealed.
That's an understandable idea.
Okay. Good.
Now,
yeah.
Please introduce the Malchus and what was the other?
Oh, the Shem Havaya. Is this because of his kingship or his kindness?
Is this because?
Is this fact that the world conceals God, that we do not experience God within the world, resultant of his kindness or his kingship? Because in chapter 4 we said that the world is created in general because of his kindness. Here we seem to be saying the world is created because of his kingship. And the answer is that it is not a contradiction. The fact that it is created as something which is part of him and nullified to God is his kindness. The fact that it is separate from him and a reality over which he can be king is due to his kingship. Two different aspects, two different truths.
One more time. The fact that...
Which part?
Well, that's what I'm trying to deconstruct the sentence. So we have this concealment, and we're trying to explain whether it's his kingship or it's his kindness. So we're really saying that...
The answer is it's his kingship, is the answer. The concealment is due to his kingship. That's the answer.
But the creation is also due to his kindness.
Correct.
So his kingship and his kindness in some way are intertwined.
Exactly, correct.
Okay, and we've given names to each one,
Correct.
which are descriptive of the names of God.
Correct. They connect. They are.
Manifestation of God.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Ness.
Or non-manifestations, whatever. But the point is that the names describe God acting in different modes. Let's put it that way, doing different things. So one thing that he does is he creates in an infinite act of creation, an infinite act of kindness. The other thing that he does is he makes within that creation a realm where he is not known.
Okay, so one can talk about the God of kindness and the God of kingship, and they're both the same God.
Of course. That's why we don't describe them as the God of kindness and the God of kingship, because it implies that there's two gods, God forbid. That's why we say it this way.
Third God forbid.
We say that it's a name, we say that they're different names of God, they're different acts, they're different expressions, different ways of putting it. The exact nature of the spheros, of what the, so to speak, metaphysically we're describing, we'll speak about much more in later chapters of this work. As we go on, we're going to get a more complex understanding of what these names relate to. So far, the definition the Alter Rebbe has given is acts, which works just fine for most purposes until you get into deeper into Kabbalistic metaphysics and are trying to answer certain questions. That thinking of it as acts is just fine. In the previous discourse that we learned, in the Tzemach Tzedek's Mitzvahs Hamanas Elokus, we were learning about the mitzvah of faith, right? In that discourse, he did it the opposite way. He explained first what the spheros are, right? He said, you remember the whole discussion, the Rambam, the Maharal, what are they? Are they God himself? Are they separate acts of God, etc.? We landed on sort of a middle position, and then he goes on to explain the ramifications. Shaar HaYichud ve'emunah, the author, what we're learning now, the order is reversed. We're really discussing, we're doing it ground up in a much more traditional philosophical style, right? We're starting with the world, really, and what is the world, and working our way sort of up the ladder. So it's the opposite order, but you'll see that we'll end up in a very similar place, I think, in that regard.
But the kindness of God is involved in the creation also, correct?
Correct.
And the kingship of God allows us to understand that there's only one way that God can be manifested in our consciousness.
I wouldn't put it that way. The kingship of God is the expression of God's desire to be king, and that desire can only be fulfilled, more or less, barring all the questions you could ask. But that desire can only be fulfilled in a reality that perceives itself as separate from him. That is what Alter Rebbe is saying. Because our reality perceives itself as separate from God, unlike higher realities, right? Or unlike what the world would be if it was only kindness and not his kingship as well, then
So without kindness, you invite subjugation.
I wouldn't put it that way. We're really discussing without kingship. Without kindness, in the theoretical, I don't know if it would work without kindness. I think let's go a little bit further, because as I said, the next 3 weeks we're going to do kingship. So we'll get a much clearer understanding, right, of how kingship relates to kindness and other things that we're discussing. We haven't even brought in Gvura and Elokim and discipline into this discussion, right? We'll as we move on, I think we'll get a much better sense. I just wanted to point out here, because he says the world is created through kingship, in case this contradicted anything anyone thought from chapter 4, I was trying to lay the groundwork for further discussion on that when it comes up. Where are we here? Second line of 9:11. What is the world? Yesh Gamor, a completely independent reality. V'davar nifrad bifnei atzmei, a separate entity of its own. V'enei batel b'metzias mamish, and not absolutely nullified to God. Right? That is what his trait of kingship is accomplishing. In other words, the fact that why is the world in this way, completely independent and separate entity and not absolutely nullified, because he wants a place in which his kingship can be revealed, in which his kingship can be felt. Ki bestalkus midazu v'shem zeh, chas v'shalom. If God were to withdraw his trait of kingship, here again we'll see another difference between kingship and kindness in this little sentence here. If he were to remove his trait of kingship and his name of Adnus, chas v'shalom, God forbid, haya ha'elam chezer l'makere, the world would return to its source, b'dvar avaya v'ruach piv yisbarech, in the word of God and the breath of his mouth may it be blessed. If there were no trait of kingship, the world would return to its source in his breath. It would be totally nullified, and it wouldn't have the name world. The name world could not be applied to it at all. We wouldn't be able to call it a world. So first of all, the first interesting thing you may notice is that in the first two, maybe three chapters of Shaar HaYichud v'Emunah, of Tanya, we had a different phrase of what would happen if he withdrew his act of creation, right? You remember? Yeah. We said at the beginning of Shaar HaYichud v'Emunah, we said if he withdrew his act of creation, what would happen?
Everything would go back to what
was retroactive.
Yes, retroactively be nothingness, as if he never created anything. Here we're saying if he withdrew his name, the world would be batal b'metzias. It would return to its source, not to nothingness, right? This is the difference. This is the difference between the two names, right? If God's kindness weren't there, the world would be absolutely non-existent at all. Absolute nothingness, right? If he stopped speaking the world into existence, right? If there were no trait of malchus, the world would be one with its source, totally indistinguishable from its source, to the extent that you wouldn't be able to call it a world at all, which is a very interesting categorization, and that will be our next topic. That's what we will be discussing presently. What does it mean that you wouldn't be able to call it a world at all? Good evening. Is it we're more or less clear up until this point, everyone? More or less? More or less. Okay. As I said, there'll be much more on kingship. As we go on, we can build up our understanding. By the way, a different way of putting this idea we just stated, that without Malchus, the world would return to its divine source, right? Without his kingship, a different way of saying this is what we said in the previous chapter, which is that his gvura, his tzimtzum, his self-concealment, right? His self-concealment is an act of kindness, right? Is really also part of kindness. Here we see the point very clearly, because if he was not contracting himself, the world wouldn't even be able to be called a world. What is the kindness, in other words, of his self-concealment? The kindness is not sharing himself, because he's concealed, right? That's a different idea from the last chapter, right? That he's equally present here. But the idea that his self-withholding is also kindness, right? What is the kindness? Not that the world should know him, per se. What is the kindness? At the simple level, the kindness is that the world should be able to be a world. Or to put it slightly differently, for the universe to be the universe, for it to have its own essence, right? For it to be a thing, literally, right? It's not a thing, as people say nowadays. So we would say about the universe, it's not a thing, right? For it to be a thing, for it to be itself, right, requires his self-concealment. And that is the kindness of his self-concealment. It's an act of kindness. It's part of the divine act of kindness. I'm not only going to create it with kindness, I'm going to create it in a way that it could even be called an olam. It could even be called a universe. It could even have its own existence, its own definition. Right?
So if it was within his source, it didn't have malchut, it wouldn't be kindness?
What? No. That's kindness, but it's not the other form of kindness, which is his self-concealment, right? We were saying in the last chapter that there's chesed and there's gvura, and gvura is also chesed. There's kindness, there's self-withholding, self-discipline, and the self-discipline is also an act of kindness. So I'm saying here, we see here why it's also an act of kindness, just at the simple level. At the simple level. Okay. So what does it mean that it wouldn't be called a world? That's what the Alter Rebbe turns to next. What would it mean if you wouldn't be able to call it an olam? You wouldn't be able to call it a world. Continues the Alter Rebbe, 3 lines up on 9:11. V'hinei Geder b'chinas shem elam neifel al b'chinas makim b'chinas man dafka. The definition, the term, the name world applies only to things which have an aspect of time, a dimension of time, he translates here, it's a good translation, and a dimension of space. Space and time. A world is something which has space and time. What is space and time? Says the Alter Rebbe, very simply. Counterintuitively simply. In fact, it's so simple that it's actually mind-blowingly deep. Crazy. Crazy. It says very simply, B'chinas makim hu mizrach u'ma'ariv tzafan dara ma'lo mata. What is space? Is the six directions, or the three dimensions, right? Three dimensions in different terms. He has east and west, north, south, up and down. Is space? B'chinas zman, what is time? Avar, heve, va'asid. Past, present, and future. Now, I have to pause and say many things. First of all, when you're dealing with time and space as concepts, makam and zman, mind-boggling concepts, very hard to understand. And there's a simple reason for that, because as the Alter Rebbe has just said, these are really the two existences which precede all existences with which we are familiar, right? In other words, makom and zman are special. Space and time are special. Makom and zman. Makom is space, zman is time. Very special things, because unlike the table and the pen, right, where the two different things cannot exist in the same space and in the same time, in the same space at the same time, right? Space and time contain everything else within them, right? They're almost inverse creations. They're the opposite. They're the grounds on which everything else takes place, if you understand what I'm saying. They're like the paper, as Eyal was saying before. They're the paper that everything in the world is written on. So it's not a contradiction to space to have things in its space, if you understand what I'm saying. It's not a contradiction to time to have things in its time, as opposed to everything else which exists. So space and time are almost paradoxical in that they exist, but the way they exist is that they contain and allow for everything else, right?
One package.
Makes them very...
The word olam contains both.
Makes them very confusing. Makes it very confusing. A second thing I should like to point out is that time and space exist spiritually and not just physically. This is necessary not just conceptually, as we'll discuss in a little bit what we mean, but also mitzad what we just said, the Kabbalah. The Kabbalah here, it's also necessary. Because we just said that everything, all the universes are created from Malchus. You should know in general, when we talk about spheres without talking about what world they're in, we mean the spheres of Atzilus, the spheres of the highest spiritual worlds. And there are at least 3 spiritual worlds between us and Malchus of Atzilus. Therefore, ipso facto, if Malchus creates worlds, and the worlds exist there in some sense, that must mean time and space exist there in some sense, as we will discuss. So time and space are not just physical, they are also spiritual, like everything else in the world, right? According to Chassidus, everything physical has a spiritual source. There is a physical cup, and there is a spiritual cup from which it's derived, right? From which its soul derives, from which its spiritual energy comes from. The same is true of time and space. That's the second point I want to make. The third point I want to make is let's turn to what these things are specifically. Let's turn to what these things are specifically. In modern parlance, we say, when we talk about space, we say there's 3 dimensions. I would argue that the Alter Rebbe's numbering 6 is not only more Kabbalistically acceptable because space derives from the 6 midas of Zah, as our local Kabbalists can explain to you, but so in other words, the 6 divine traits, Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, Netzach, Ed, and Yesod, correspond to the six dimensions as the Alter Rebbe has listed them. I'm not sure which to which, don't ask. I don't know which to which exactly, not for all 6 anyway. I could take a stab at 1 or 2 maybe. But the not just Kabbalistically does it make sense, but conceptually it makes sense as well. So let me make that the basis of our discussion of space. Why is it smarter to have 6 dimensions instead of 3? Right? In other words, we're describing the same thing. The difference is that the Alter Rebbe is defining the dimensions by the 2 extremes, right? Rather than just as an axis, right? That's basically the difference, right? When we say 3 dimensions, we mean, like in the Cartesian plane, you have the x-axis, the y-axis, and the z-axis for depth, right? So the Alter Rebbe is not naming an axis, right? He's naming the endpoints of the axis. You have east and west for your this way, right? You have up and down, and you have north and south, or whichever way it is, whatever. The point is that the Alter Rebbe is describing the extremes of the axis. Why is that eminently logical? It's implicit in the notion of the axes. In other words, really to say 3 dimensions in these 6 directions is to say exactly the same thing, just with different names. But why are the 6 names better than 3 names? I'll explain to you very simple. Because everything that is within space, definitionally speaking, everything that is within space is defined by opposites. It's defined by these extremes. It has what we would call in Hebrew hischalkus. It has multiplicity, right? The whole point of existing within the dimensions, right, is that you have an extension. You go from one closer to one end until closer to another end. Another way of putting this, in much shorter terms, is that everything has its limits, right? Everything has its tchum. How would you translate tchum? It's border. Its gvul is border. Its tchum is its
Area. It's area.
Everything has its area, its space, right? Space is redundant because we're defining space, but space is circular. In space, everything has its space. It's very helpful.
It's boundary.
Its boundary.
Boundaries, yes.
Boundary. There's different words. Gvul, geder, tchum, right? They're all aiming at sort of the same. I'm sure there's subtle differences, but they're all aiming at the same idea, which is that in space, everything has boundaries, right? The only thing we talk about, the only object we talk about which has no extension in space in any of the directions is a mathematical point, which is not clear. I'm not even sure if it actually exists. It's not just a theoretical thing, right? It's a point is a no-dimensional construct.
North, south, east, and west, etc.
Yeah.
Don't have boundaries.
What doesn't have boundaries? No. That's the whole point. The whole point. They themselves don't have boundaries. That's why Malcolm is so weird.
They have direction.
They have direction.
They have direction
Exactly.
within space.
Exactly. That's the point.
Space,
They define space.
we don't quite know what the boundary of space is.
The point is not right. The point is not that space itself is finite. That's not the point. As I was saying before, space itself in Chassidus even is counterintuitive. We're not talking really about the nature of space itself. We are, whatever. Let's put that aside. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. That point that I was going to make doesn't matter. I don't want to confuse myself. If I confuse myself, I'll confuse you, likely. Everything in space is defined by boundaries. What's the point of space, in other words? What's the advantage of having space? The advantage of having space is so that not everything is in the same location, right? Is to say that this cup extends from here to here in this direction, and here to here in this direction, and here to here, right? In the 3 dimensions, you can explain to me where the cup ends and where other things are allowed to begin. Clear? In other words, what are we really saying in a deeper metaphysical point? Definition beyond Malchus, beyond the world of Atzilus, lower than Atzilus. Definition in our worlds and in the spiritual worlds, definition is dependent on these opposites. Or to put it, these opposites like north, south, east, west. Things are... another way of putting it, how is everything defined? Things are defined in terms of things that are not themselves, right? Within the worlds, this is generally true. What are time and space? Time and space gives you a means of defining things, not in terms of themselves, right? If I tell you, this pen is just a pen, right? The way there may be a place where the pen is just a pen, but it's not within this lower spiritual worlds or within the physical worlds. Within the physical worlds, the pen has aspects, right? There's an aspect to which it's east, there's an aspect to which it's west, there's an aspect to which it's north, an aspect to which it's south, Yes? Everything is fundamentally defined by opposites, by division, by things other than itself. These are the terms in which things in the world are defined. How do these terms, we'll see this more clearly. We'll see this more clearly if we see how they're defined spiritually. Rabbi Yoel, thankfully, shout out to Rabbi Yoel for including the spiritual aspects of all three dimensions, which is wonderful because I don't know if I've ever seen all three in one place before, which is very nice for me. Rabbi Yoel explains what all of these things are in Chassidus, right? Each of the three dimensions. Higher and lower means of more importance and of less importance. Right? This is the sense in which we say that that comment has no space in this synagogue. Right? That comment has no space. It's too lowly. It's not important enough. Doesn't belong here. Right? Higher things in space are things which are more important. This is the spiritual notion of higher and lower. East and west are front and back. Front and back, spiritually front and back, right? Panim va'achar, we would say in Hebrew. For example, we say that the holy things, like your tefillin, for example. What's the spiritual difference between your tefillin and a cheeseburger in their soul, right? This is a throwback to the first part of Tanya, if you'll remember, near the beginning.
The existence
Yeah.
from either panim or
The tefillin receive their life from God in a way of panim, right? Face to face. They are able to unite with their source. We're not getting into a whole discussion of what that means. I'm just saying this is the language that's used there, right? They receive panim. Klipa, right? Things which conceal God, not even in the regular sense, but even more so, right? Things which conceal God, which are the opposite of Torah, right? They receive their life force, their vitality in a way of acharayim. They receive from the back, right? It says leman. What's the term in Aramaic? Basar kasfei, right? The one who gives over his shoulder, giving a gift to someone over their shoulder. You may remember that language from earlier Tanya studies. That's east and west. So up and down is greater importance, less importance. Generally speaking, those definitions themselves are very deep. What that means could be a very deep concept. You also have front and back in the spiritual sense, which means the difference between something united with its source or rejecting its source. And then you have south and north, which are corresponded to right and left, respectively. It's always this way. It's always this way. I think it has to do with the way you would face in the Beis HaMikdash, is I believe what it has to do. Kindness is on the, south and north, Darim and Sofin. On the right hand is kindness, that's where the menorah was. On the left hand is Gvura, that's where the Shulchan was. It's a whole teaching. But anyway.
So right is Darum. Right is Darum.
Yes, right is left. Right is left. Right is south, and left is north. One is God's kindness. These are the two spheres that I do know what they correspond to in the six, right? The right is kindness, is chesed. Left is Gvura, is severity. So in other words, just as every physical object has its own unique place that could be defined, well, nowadays you would use longitude and latitude and maybe a couple of other numbers. You could define its unique place in the universe, right? And that place would be representative of where it is in three dimensions. So too, every spiritual notion, every spiritual concept has the same thing. It exists in a specific spiritual place, as defined in these three dimensions: higher and lower, panim and achar, front and back, which are front and back, and chesed and gvura, kindness or severity. Don't ask me how this works exactly, but the idea of spiritual space is clear. We've discussed it in this class before. For example, the equation a squared plus b squared equals c squared, the Pythagorean theorem, and the equation 2 plus 2 equals 4 occupy different spiritual spaces. They don't occupy different physical spaces because they don't occupy any physical space. They're not physical. But they occupy different spiritual spaces. One is not the other. There's a place where one ends and the other begins, right? They have clearly delineated realms in a spiritual sense. And this is true of all spiritual things, at least below the world, below Malchus, at least in the lower three worlds. And as we're going to discuss, even Malchus itself, but as we'll get into that, even God's attribute of kingship itself has this aspect. So there is physical space and there is spiritual space. What's the common denominator? What makes it all space is that things are defined in terms of other things that come in pairs. Things are defined in terms of other things and with division. More something, more one thing, less another thing. Right? More to the right, less to the left. This much to the right, this much to the left, etc.
So where's your common point, your starting point?
So maybe it's all relative. I don't know.
Well,
Einstein, I don't know.
Activity needs
Yeah.
a starting point.
Yeah, no, I agree. I fundamentally agree. What this actually means, if you want to start bringing in Einstein, etc., if you really wanted to, is that the very notion of a divine reference point, right? I would say that the Alter Rebbe says this in very different language, more or less explicitly in Torah or in his Maimarim. But the very idea of a divine reference point is something which is created with Malchus. In other words, the very idea that God has a certain view on the universe in a specific way is from a lower expression. It's concurrent with this desire for kingship. It's not something which is inherent to God. This gives us two concepts, one called Das Tachton, one called Das Elyon, a lower level of knowledge, a higher level of knowledge, and this answers many questions about what it says in the Torah and things about knowledge and free choice. All sorts of things are answered by the two different divine knowledges, the knowledge which is above any perspective, above any reference point, and the knowledge which is within a reference point. So perhaps we could connect the two ideas. Yesh Lema, perhaps we could propose, well, it could be, we could write it up from our Chassidus class and send it out as an original Torah idea from this class, mostly Daryl's, that the whole idea of spiritual space with a reference, the Einsteinian idea of a reference point, right? It's not a reference point. It's what's it called now? That you can only a reference point. It's not a perspective. It's something like that. Reference frame of reference, thank you, figured it out. The frame of reference, the whole idea of a divine frame of reference, even in the spiritual world, is something which derives from Malchus, as a Das Tachton, as a lower level perspective. So, sorry to open the door on that rather abstruse...
Malchus as general or Malchus de Asiya Gashmi?
No, we're talking about Malchus of Atzilus. All Malchus here is Malchus of Atzilus, unless said otherwise. Time is basically the same thing, right? In a different way, obviously. We're not really going to get into the difference in the way now. But time is very much the same thing. You have past, present, and future. Time is the same thing. Now, there's two different types of time according to Chassidus, as we learned in our last mimer, right? Time is a very complex thing. There's a time which is beyond time, and then there's time itself, right? Time and the source of time we learned in our previous mimer, right? If you recall.
What is time beyond time?
We were explaining the spiritual time. Don't you remember as the various spheres unfold from Akudim, from Adam Kadman? We learned this in our previous discourse. You can go find the class on YouTube if you like. I think it was chapter 9, if I remember correctly. If I'm honest, maybe. Anyway, the divine time, it's the whole thing, right? Different time, different thing. But the basic point, right? Why are time and space the two definitions of the universe? It's the same thing. Time also allows us to define a thing in terms of something else, right? So basically, if you were writing a universe, an Elam generating program, a universe generating program, the two fundamental variables you would define first are time and space. Everything else can be defined in terms of time and space. That's what you would bootstrap with,
Space
right?
means nothing without time.
They come together, granted. Which one's first, which one's higher, I don't know. You have to ask your local Orthodox rabbi. But yeah, they come together, and they make a universe together. Both things. There's much more in Chassidus on time and space. If you wanted to make a study of it, you could go wild. All sorts of interesting things. But this is the basic point we're saying here. So time and space are the fundamental, very hard to get a handle on them directly, but they're the basis of his chalkus. They're the basis of multiplicity. How is everything else multiple? How does everything else have multiple aspects, right? East versus west, north versus south, past versus future, right? Where does everything get its multiplicity from? From time and space. These are the predefined things by which everything else gets its universeness from, right? Where everything else derives its worldness, its universeness, its olamkeit from. Yes? Says the Rebbe in a mimer. I guess we'll finish with this. Make a note here. Says the Rebbe in a mimer. If there was no tzimtzum, if there was no divine self-concealment, everything would have no space and no time. As we'll discuss more next week, God willing, this is if there's no malchus, if there's no divine kingship, if there's no divine self-concealment, everything would exist, but with no space and no time. And the Rebbe says a davar nifla, a wondrous thing. You can think about this for at least a week until the next class. What does the Rebbe say? Why would it be that with no divine concealment, everything would have no space and no time? The Rebbe says, because if there was no tzimtzum, if there was no divine self-concealment, if there was no divine kingship necessitating a world separate from him, then what would everything feel and know in its depth? Was its very identity the fact that God creates it? The fact that God creates me is what I am. That's what the Rebbe says. The Rebbe says that's what I would feel. I would feel if there was no tzimtzum, if there was no concealment, and there was no malchus, there was no kingship, everything would feel, what would it know about itself? It would know about itself only that God creates me. And in this, the Rebbe says, everything is the same. Everything is the same. There's no divisions, no multiplicity. Everything knows that God creates me. And if that is how you define yourself, rather than being self-defined, right? What's the universe way of self-definition, right? I'm me, but what does that mean practically in the universe? It means that I'm higher or lower, I'm panim va'achar, face or back, I'm kindness or severity, right? These different aspects combined. I'm also in a certain place in 3 dimensions and at a certain time.
I'm not someone else.
I'm not in someone else's space and I'm not in someone else's time, right? Not as simultaneously anyway, right? So and in the spiritual sense as well is what I was saying. Also, I also have a unique spiritual identity, but all of this self-definition is what makes it self-definition in the universe. In other words, the whole idea of self-definition and the idea of universality, which is the wrong word in English, it implies the wrong thing. The idea of being in a universe and self-definition, right, are really concurrent ideas. The whole idea that I should be self-defined, in other words, defined by where I am, right, which means defined in time and space, spiritually and physically, right? That whole idea that I should be so defined is a reflection of God's concealment. If God was revealed to me, as is the truth of my existence, all I would be defined as is not in terms of self. That's the whole point. I wouldn't be defined in terms of self. I would be defined in terms of the fact that God creates me. And in the fact that God creates me, everything that exists is identical. Right. And so everything that exists would not exist in a way of time and space. That's what the Rebbe says.
It wouldn't be understandable.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. The whole notion of time and space, which is wrapped up with this idea of self-definition, that myself is defined by where I'm not and when I'm not, right? That whole idea would be totally lost. That my only definition would be in godly terms. I would be defined as this thing which God is creating now. And in this sense, there's no space differences and there's no time differences between things. And that's what the Rebbe says in his mimer. Much more on this topic next week, God willing.